Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and I've been thinking that in this time of austerity we've got to find a way of coming up with cheaper musicals. So may I present you with these. Joseph in his perfectly average gabardine raincoat, My Bald Lady, and of course Cat. And that isn't the last list of musicals we'll have here in this episode of Musical Talk, because very shortly we're going to be discussing 4 you could have seen at this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Today, the day we broadcast this episode, is, alas, the first day after the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe has closed. And as I've made comment before, it's a very sad day because it means we're as far from the next Edinburgh Festival Fringe as it's possible to be. But I'm counting down the days already to the 2020 offerings. But just because it's finished doesn't mean it's forgotten. And for every one of us who was able to go, I have no doubt that we will have, and do have, some great memories of the world's largest arts festival, and if you're a Musical Talk listener, of some of the musicals you could have seen there. And to help jog your memory, today I'm conducting the first of my annual Edinburgh Festival Fringe roundups. And, as is traditional, this episode is going to be a case of me sitting down with the wonderful Michael Gordon Shapiro, the noted American composer and great hit of the recent Hollywood Fringe, where his new show The Bully Problem was quite rightly lauded, to discuss 4 musical shows which we saw at the 2019 Edinburgh Festival Fringe. And therefore, here's that second list I promised you. Today we're going to be talking about Space Junk, the Soviet musical, How to Use a Washing Machine, Shreds, a Jack the Ripper musical, and a show which might be more widely known, Sweet Charity. That exuberant 1960s musical with the great score by Cy Coleman and Dorothy Fields. So the only thing between you and listening to that conversation is me whittering on, so I'm going to stop so we can go straight into it. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mike Shapiro. Musical Talk. Mike, what a great tradition we've developed over the last few years of always meeting here at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and then, even more exciting, I think, seeing shows together and then talking about them. And that's, of course, pretty much what we're going to do today. I don't think there's any more I can add to that to explain what's going to happen.
No real surprises here. This is the highlight of one of the highlights of my year, so a meta highlight, if you will.
But I think it would be wrong of me not to mention the fact that you have just essentially hot-footed it from the Hollywood Fringe, where your own show has just been massively successful, winning plaudits here, there and everywhere. I know that you and I are going to talk about The Bully Problem and where it goes now in another episode, but I did just want to ask you how you're feeling. Because one fringe to another, it seems to be very tiring, let alone pleasant.
Well, if there was some way to do this all year round, I would. Some kind of perpetual fringe experience. It's nice to be at a festival like this where I have no actual responsibilities and I can just be an audience member. That's a real pleasure.
But you and I have done our traditional thing. We've both got schedules of shows that we're going to see or have seen, some of which we saw together, some of which we have both seen but not at the same time. And there's a number of shows which I've seen that you haven't, and vice versa. And over a couple of episodes, or possibly more, we're going to be talking about those here for Musical Talk. But today I think we're going to concentrate on the ones that you and I saw together for the most part. And possibly the biggest name of those is Sweet Charity. Now, what did you know about Sweet Charity before you went in to see the production we saw together?
I knew it had music by Cy Coleman, and not much beyond that. I lumped it into a category that I called old-timey, kind of jazzy musicals from the 60s, and that's about where it stood in my imagination before I saw it the other evening.
It's a late golden age flowering kind of thing, isn't it, I think? It's almost one of the last, unless you count Jerry Herman in that sort of category of slightly backward-looking, very jolly musicals, I think.
Yes, the boundless optimism of musical theatre had not quite burnt itself out by the late 60s, so I think we're seeing the tail end of that tradition.
And it is a very optimistic piece. What I knew about it, I mean, I must say I have seen it before in London. I saw a professional production with Bonnie Langford in the charity role. I've seen a gender swap version here in Edinburgh a few years ago, which was intriguing as a concept, although perhaps didn't pay off. Not completely, anyway. And, of course, I know the piece itself, mostly from its score, which is tremendously strong. As you say, Cy Coleman writing the music and Dorothy Fields writing the lyrics. It's quite a late flowering for Dorothy Fields as well. She was quite an old woman by this stage, and I know that she uses a lot of late 60s slang in this, very successfully, actually, in a very accessible way. And at the time, it was considered rather impressive that someone of such venerable age would be able to sort of tap into the then zeitgeist. But I think the thing we were both surprised by was the book, in terms of who wrote it, and whether that was a good thing or not. And we'll get on to the actual narrative in a minute. But it's Neil Simon, isn't it? And neither of us had quite clocked that before we went in.
No, I had no idea. Neil Simon was the it playwright of the 60s and perhaps the decade that followed. He was often called in as a touch-up person, a consultant, a dramaturg, and had enormously successful productions on Broadway. Not musicals per se. I associate him more with straight plays like Jake's Women and Biloxi Blues and Brighton Breach Memoirs and that series of semi-autobiographical pieces, but I had never heard of him participating in a musical before.
And in a British context, Neil Simon, I think, is always remembered as, well, he's thought of as a comic writer over here. And I think The Odd Couple is, if you like, the sort of the epitome of what we think of as a Neil Simon play.
I think we associate him with a kind of snappy exchange of one-liners and humor that might seem a little bit quaint today and sometimes is a little bit creaky, but still has some comedic value even decades later.
Yes, he's a zinger bringer, isn't he, really? That would
Yes.
be the best way of describing it. So there we are, we've got the foundation stones for Sweet Charity. So let's talk about the piece itself. Now, do you want to give a brief description of the narrative arc as best you can?
Sure, as it peers through the hazy clouds of recent memory, we are introduced...
Clouds being the thing here in Edinburgh this year, by the way.
Exactly, in abundant supply. Listeners at home, you have no idea. It's just grey in all directions, but that's part of the charm. We are introduced to Charity, who is I don't actually know her role, but I think she's either an exotic dancer, what we would call an exotic dancer today, or some equivalent. She works in a gentleman's club,
yes,
as the euphemism goes. And she
calls herself a dance club hostess, I notice.
That may have just been the term at the time.
Yes, which is not to say prostitute per se.
No, there's clearly, the implication is there's a gray line between prostitution and what she does, and some of her colleagues cross that line. She does not, so she has the proverbial heart of gold, even though she works in an industry that might be considered seedy. She has her heart on her sleeve. She appears to be constantly falling in love with guys who mistreat her, and indeed in the very first scene, we see her literally pushed into a pond and her money stolen by her presumptive fiancé. Does that seem right?
That's the right terminology, because she hadn't actually agreed to marry him, or he hadn't quite agreed to marry her, I think might be the better way of putting it, yes.
Exactly, a préancé, if you will.
I like that.
Thank you. Not bad for early in the morning.
And then the piece continues, I think... My historic response to Sweet Charity has always been, I think the score has got a lot of very good things in it, and I think its long-term reputation rests mostly on the quality of that score. I've always found the book to be terribly, terribly scrappy and episodic. There is an overarching arc, but it's actually, more than anything, it is an investigation into, and that's a strong word, I don't know what the word would be really, but it revolves around Charity and her personality and her optimism as she sort of bumps through this scene and then that scene. Almost no one she meets on her travels does she ever meet again, so there's nothing by means of a subplot. Not that it has to be per se, but it does make for a very sort of bitty piece. The constants in her life are the people who work with her in her gentleman's club. You know, the fellow girls, and indeed Herman, who's, the word isn't pimp, but is certainly the manager of this establishment. So it's all about her. And at one level, that's wonderful. You know, she's a very interesting, lovable character, actually. Played very magnificently on the day we saw it, I think, by someone who I think got that across. But she has this scene where she meets a film star who sort of takes her in for the evening, non-sexually, partly to spite his lover of some variety, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But once that scene's over, we never see him again. And Act 1 ends with her meeting the person who looks like he's the best prospect that she's going to get, a fellow called Oscar, who is a proper Neil Simon neurotic New Yorker in every possible sense.
And he is very reminiscent of a Neil Simon character in that he's somewhat lovable, he is non-threatening, and he's a little unhinged. He seems to be a little maladjusted to the outside world. He's got some anxieties, but he also seems to be a nice guy, if eccentric. So
good at heart is what he comes across as.
Exactly. Yeah. And we think, well, here's a believable prospect for Charity, because he seems to really care for her, but he's not so well adjusted that he's got the world at his feet. So maybe because his options are more limited, and maybe because his expectations are different, maybe the two of them have found the right match.
So Act 2 is all about how their relationship develops, and then the final payoff on that. But even then, Act 2 is still a series of skits. You know, they go to a New Age church, which is based under the Brooklyn Bridge and seems to have grown out of a jazz club, which allows us a magnificent number, and yet has no bearing on anything at all. You know, they go in, they have their lovely sing-song, there's a police raid, and they run away again. The end of that scene, no one from that scene comes back again. Very, very bitty. That's exactly how I found it originally, and that's how I found it again just recently. But I did enjoy the piece, and for me that's the score. What was your response to it? Well, I would like to disconnect the ending, because that is where we both have some issues.
Indeed.
But if we take it up to the point before the last 10 minutes, how would you respond to Sweet Charity?
The show does a good job of fulfilling one of the tasks of a musical, which is making you feel sympathetic with the main character. And in this case, we feel not just sympathy per se, but we admire her optimism, her willingness to look for love and to cautiously believe in the possibility of love for herself. And there's a contrast object, which is her cohort of fellow adult club workers who are all cynical, who all have seen Charity fail time after time. They are not only cynical about their own prospects, but of hers. And she defies them all by saying, no, I found a guy, love is possible, here I'm paraphrasing, I can be happy. And we want her to succeed, very much so, because she's such a innocent, likable character. And I think on a broader level, we want to believe that hope is real and that someone can emerge from their circumstances. And I'll also stress this is not a Little Orphan Annie situation where someone is plucked out of a bad situation just by virtue of being front and center when a millionaire shows up.
And so cute.
I know. She is liked, I believe, for her virtues. Oscar really sees something in her and it feels legit. She's not just an interchangeable member of her group. So during the second act, there's this tension because she is nervous about revealing her profession to Oscar out of fear that he will dump her. And we really want them to get together, and we're also concerned. What's going to happen? Is she going to try to hide her career from him indefinitely? Is he going to find out? And we're hooked on this. We really want to see her succeed. And I think this does elevate at least the second act above the episodic quality that you described, even though I do acknowledge your point there.
It is about a relationship, and it takes us all the way back to Charity, because actually there is no other plot. It is us rooting for her to succeed, and as you say, it looks like she's going to do so. And I suppose the episodes in Act 2 are really a way of showing them and their relationship getting closer, whilst, as you say, Charity grapples with this issue about coming clean. So let us get on to the ending. The ending is very circular, so it's neat on paper, in the sense that, and spoilers, ladies and gentlemen, at the very last scene, the very thing that Chastity had been... Ooh, there's a slip. The very thing that Charity had been concerned about, which was that she might be rejected by Oscar for having had a history, shall we say, certainly the suggestion of a sexual history, is the very thing that actually he cannot deal with and does see their relationship fail, quite starkly at the end. And in a slightly ham-fisted way, as he's rejecting her, he, and I think we have to give him the benefit of the doubt here, accidentally pushes her back into the pond. So there's this beautiful circularity that she ends up in exactly the same place she started. That's what it looks like on paper. That is what happens. But I know that, well, on the night, you and I had different responses to this. So she is left flat on her own, all dreams defeated again, wet in a pond. And then there's a little reprise of one of the songs, one of the most upbeat, defiant songs, actually, I think, that comes from earlier in the score. But the ending is quite stark in that sense.
And we should supplement this by saying that she had already been proposed to by Oscar, and she accepted. And
yes, it was done in good faith, wasn't it?
It was, and the show set up an expectation that this was going to work because it was a big, rousing number about weddings. And
I love to cry at weddings.
I love to cry at weddings, and I thought that was the finale. I thought we were going to see the vows right after that, because that would have been a lovely place to end the show.
The vows or the vows?
Either or. You could have segued from one to the other. So that was a really happy, as it turned out, penultimate moment in the story. But and I believe Charity had gone to the lengths of setting up a joint bank account and really committing herself to this relationship. And upon being given the news, made a pitch for herself. She expressed how much love she had to give. We were dragged along the bumpy road with her, and then saw her rejected despite all her optimism, despite all her virtue and her sweetheartedness. So that's a pretty tough place to leave your audience in a show that's not truly tragic to begin with. It was a bit of a twist, and I don't necessarily feel like it was a good one. This is segueing, of course, into our respective reactions to the ending.
Well, on the night when we discussed it, and it was only a couple of nights ago, you said you loved it up until the last 10 minutes and then felt really as though you'd been punched in the gut, as it were. I had a slightly different response. Now, I don't know if that's because I've seen a version of it before, but the way I responded to that is I've always detested the Oscar character because I think he does lead her on, not willingly, not deliberately, because there's this element, isn't there, that he does say that he's trying to forget her past, but he knows that eventually it will eat him up, and it is already doing so. So much better for them to separate before they're sort of yoked together in marriage. But he is a bit of a rotter in that sense. He's a damaged man, but that's still quite a heartless thing to do, I think. There's no suggestion that he's ever going to try and get over his problems. So I suppose you could argue he's being magnanimous in trying not to yoke her to eternal misery. On the other hand, he is metaphorically as well as literally dunking her in the pond, I think. So it's a character I've always found very difficult to like. And also there is an element of that whiny, neurotic character that we've seen possibly too often in comedies. But my response to it was that there she was at the very end, in exactly the same place as she was at the very beginning, but fractionally better. He hadn't robbed her. He had at least given her a reason, which her previous fiancé, as you splendidly called it, didn't do. So, and also she sings, "There's got to be something better than this," which is earlier on a defiant number, even if it leads not necessarily to anything. So I think you could argue that with her optimism and her defiance and the indefatigability, which we've seen all the way through the piece anyway, and she does have that. You know, she's to quote another Dorothy Fields lyric, she picks herself up and starts all over again. So to me, that looked like that, oh dear, she'd met another setback, but she wasn't going to let that setback set her back, if that makes any kind of sense. So I don't like the ending because, like you, I do want it to be a very positive ending because we grow to like her a great deal. Well, she's likeable from the off, but I just think she becomes more lovable as the thing goes on. So it is a terrible ending in that sense, but I detected some hope. But then you went off and did a little bit of research, because there are directorial choices about how to present that ending. And the production we saw, well, I agree with you, I think that it was given a fairly bleak outlook. So I think I was going back to my original understanding of the piece and just superimposing how I have previously felt on how I felt this time. You were seeing it for a first time, and
Indeed.
Therefore your opinion of the production that we saw, I think it's possibly the more valid.
What I saw was, for me, the definitive ending of this show. There clearly were some directorial choices that skewed the ending in a more pessimistic direction. Generally, I think the theme of the show, the story theme, is how should we feel about optimism? Is optimism justified? If you are in dire circumstances, is your fighting spirit a valuable asset, or is it naivety?
Fool's gold.
Exactly. What is the dramatic irony here? Are we watching her final defiant reprise thinking she doesn't realize she's never going to get out of there? Or are we thinking how good of her to keep up her optimistic spirit and her belief in love despite having this huge disappointment which we shared with her? I think that this show skewed the answer towards the bleak interpretation of seeing her as undesirably naive and foolish and having a now strained belief in her own future that is not justified. And I would argue that's because of the staging and perhaps the choice of reprise. And what I mean by that is it seems like there may have been some directorial choice to reprise the "There's Something Out There That I'm Going to Fight For" song. Yeah. That's heavily paraphrased. That's not actually the lyrics.
There's got to be something better than this.
Thank you. Thoughts will now do the entire score a cappella just to contextualize this. So we had speaking of a cappella, we had a 3-person a cappella kind of lachrymose reprise of what was a rhythmic and defiant song. So now it almost seems like the song has been defeated. And the lack of accompaniment really does make it ring hollow. To my ears, that said, this girl is delusional. By now, she should know she's going to be working in this gentleman's club forever. She's going to go right back to the work environment she thought she left, and this is it for her. Semicolon, optimism is not justified, and that is not a message I take to personally.
It's interesting, though, that the observation you just made a minute ago, often in a musical, and often in a drama, but certainly in a musical, you get the storm before the sunset. So the 11th hour number is quite often, it's either a realization song, or it is a, oh no, isn't everything terrible, and then the ending sort of makes everything right. This is the complete reverse of that, and that's not something I'd spotted. But in fact, absolutely, you are led down the garden path when it comes to the optimism, because I Love to Cry at Weddings, which is a barnstorming number, fantastically done, terribly, terribly catchy, the rotter, like much of the score actually, but it does feel like if it was a pantomime would end on that, exactly as you say, with the vows and the bows, because, the dame would come out marrying her prince or whoever, and then we'd get the walk down. In this, the ending is a false ending, because the wedding never actually occurs. And then we're given this downbeat ending, which I hadn't stopped to think. It's an inversion, so structurally interesting, not necessarily successful, but structurally interesting in that sense. And I think you've done a little research to suggest that in previous versions professionally, it's not been quite so downbeat.
If Wikipedia can be trusted, it seems that prior productions may have skewed more optimistically. I believe there's a mention of a lit slogan on stage that said something to the effect of, and she lived happily, hopefully, ever after. And those words, I think, change or would change the interpretation of the ending dramatically towards the positive, towards the, well, she's down, but she's not out. And I think it would have been a much more rewarding ending overall.
But that's interesting, that the very fact that it had to be done with written words. I wonder if someone at the time had the same response you did to the narrative. This is only speculation. And said, actually, this isn't necessarily optimistic enough. How can we give her that optimistic ending? Very interesting, but there should be a kind of sort of, when you see a film and you get the blank screen at the end, and then the white lettering comes up and tells you what happens to all the characters after the camera has stopped rolling. The fact that kind of technique was used to give her an optimistic ending is good, because it's unequivocal. You're told that everything's going to be relatively all right for her. But it's quite a clumsy device, it seems to me, dramatically. I don't want to criticise Neil Simon too much here, but I think the book is the weakest thing about Sweet Charity. That's my take on the thing.
I would agree. And on the other hand, I think the music is remarkable.
Yes, book and the songs, the melody and lyrics.
One thing I was remarking to you as we left the theater is that there is such a tight integration of lyrics and music along the rhythmic axis. It feels like every word choice fits exactly in the pocket of the melody. You never have a case where a word like bridge or crunch is stuffed into a 16th note. You always feel like every word has exactly as much time as it needs. If you listen to the lyrics of Big Spender, for example, you've got this very wordy A-verse. And then when we come to the reprise, which is more soaring and intervallic, you've got longer word choices with more space for more emphasis. Hey, big spender. That feels right. Everything sits. And it's such a remarkable coherence between lyrics and music that elevates the show.
And what do you think of each of the individual songs? Because I think it's got a pretty high strike rate. Even what might be called the secondary songs, I think, are fantastic. There's a song, I think, in the second act where Charity's two best mates, who are quite cynical, seem to have been temporarily won over to the idea that she's going to settle down in a suburban lifestyle, for want of anything. And they sing a fantastic duet. Charity's not on stage at this stage, which is odd, because they're sort of singing about her future life. And it's got beautiful lyrics like, we'll get the local jet set to dine on our dinette set. And of course, everything in that is fabulous. You've got the concept of jet set, as in the movers and shakers, the gentry in my head, the nice people, and the dinette set immediately identifies her as a sort of working class character, sort of trying to make good. That's the way I read that, anyway. But you've got that sort of social mobility in that couplet alone. And that's what suburban life is all about, ladies and gentlemen. That's social mobility, it seems to me.
There's also, it's a little reminiscent of Somewhere Green from Little Shop, where we have someone whose aspirations are exemplified through the trappings of perhaps a lower class or working class life, where her imagination is limited by what she's seen. And this is a similar kind of song.
We've got to talk about, there's got to be somewhere better than this. There's got to be something more we can do. It's a beautiful, powerful, defiant song, and always reminds me of America from West Side Story, in the sense it's got similar sort of what I think of as Latin American rhythms, probably quite wrongly. It's got that kind of sort of beat and bounce, and it's an energy puncher inner, if that makes any kind of sense. It raises the energy levels again in the piece, and also sets her on her way in a way, because what's quite interesting is the three of them sing this "we're all going to get out of here and make our lives better" song, and then opening hours start back at the dance hall, and her two friends sort of trudge back to work, immediately having deflated the dream that they've just all helped expand together. Whereas Charity is saying, well, aren't we going to do something about this? So you can see already she's cut from a different cloth. So it has character usage, this song. It has a dramatic function. And of course, it's, as I say, it has that energy punch, which I think is always useful to any show, any two-act show, certainly. I think it's a magnificent song.
I agree, and I think its repetition in a more defeated a cappella version at the end was poignant and touching back to that initial statement of optimism. I agree that the Latin rhythms give it a kind of vitality, and even if it's not culturally specific to the particular characters, it feels right in a more general musical way.
And then there's a song that's written specifically for Charity to sing herself, isn't there? There's Where Am I Going, I think it's called, which I've heard recordings of by various pop stars. And I find that a beautifully stark, introspective song. Because she is very aware of, she is able to introspect, actually. I think that's quite interesting. I find Charity a fascinating character anyway, because actually for a 60s show to have a central female protagonist, not just in the title but in the show, actually doing and being the characters, she meets men and men do what they do to her, but actually she is also, and she has agency in her own right. I think that's powerful, and she's what I would call working class. She's a working class woman who takes the lead and is in the complete, maybe not the complete driving seat, but is certainly one of the drivers and dynamics of her own musical. You mentioned Annie. It's a very different kettle of fish, Annie, several years later as well, by, a decade or two. I think Sweet Charity is remarkable in that sense.
I agree that she has both agency and vulnerability, which I think is a winning combination in a musical, because if a character isn't plucky, if they don't have some kind of drive, we get bored. And if they seem invulnerable, then there are no stakes and we get bored. And Charity strikes this balance between feeling like she's something to lose, but she also has something to offer in terms of her decision-making.
Just briefly, before we move on then, I just want to touch on one or two of the choices that we saw in the production that we saw. The two principal things that struck me were, they gave us a little programme, which was very nice. The first thing was that they decided to make it, and these are their words, atemporal. So they were trying to put it in a kind of no man's land in time, in terms of where it was, which I think works for Sweet Charity in a way, because it's very 60s in its... it's a very 60s piece because it came from the 60s. And in this version, for example... various people have mobile telephones, which saves a bit of time. So it's in an indeterminate post-war period, I would say. It could be any time from about 1960, I think. And the other decision they made was they've kept all the character names, but they have cast both men and women in various roles. So in the Gentlemen's Club, there are a number of dancers who were gentlemen, and clearly gentlemen. They weren't men pretending to be women. They were men, presumably offering their charms, but retaining the female names of the characters. What it did, it just sort of fluidified, terrible word, the sexuality in the piece. Not the gender, I think, but the sexuality, which just made it feel more modern. It didn't have any particular purpose, nor did it detract, I thought. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on any of those.
I think that the gender flips were unobtrusive. They didn't interrupt the story. They may have added a little bit of complexity and a brief pause as we tried to suss out certain relationships, but I don't think that's anything a modern audience member couldn't handle.
A lot of men in chiffon. Very interesting. Oh, I will just briefly pay tribute to the band, who I thought were excellent. There was a violinist and a drummer who I thought were on overtime as far as I was concerned. They were marvellous. I was very, very impressed by the orchestra.
The band was spot on, especially in the rhythmic tightness, which is essential for this kind of score.
Yeah. Yes, very much. Rhythm is such an important piece in it, isn't it? Yes. And the varied rhythms throughout, because there's a Bob Fosse, well, it's all Bob Fosse style dancing, isn't it? Because it was a Bob Fosse piece originally, and I think Gwen Verdon was the original Charity. I think they were married, weren't they? But anyway, so there's a lot of Fosse-esque percussive dancing, and therefore percussive rhythms to match that. And Big Spender, of course, I think is the best example of that.
Yeah, I think that's a good synopsis. I was impressed by the cast. I appreciated, in addition to the lead who played Charity, the gentleman who played Oscar, and I regret not having cast members' names in front of me. That tends to not happen at Edinburgh Fringe. He found a balance between sympathy and portraying someone who didn't quite feel balanced. There was something a little bit unhinged about him, and this is very important because we don't want to feel too confident, and yet we don't want to feel like he's this monster or stalker. He's just a little bit weird and eccentric.
Yeah.
And the acting choices were great in conveying that.
Lots of little ticks, perhaps, yes.
Exactly right.
Now, on the whole then, I thought we liked this production of Sweet Charity. We generally like Sweet Charity, and I think it would be very good for both of us if we ever saw a different production to see how that ending is handled again. Because I think it is going to always be that ending which makes you judge the show one way or another.
I agree. I think the way that it weighs, the fashion in which it weighs down on the question of is optimism naive is crucial to the emotional takeaway, to what we feel when we leave and what we take with us after having seen the show. And this particular production made some choices about that, and I would be interested in seeing if a different set of choices might make me cherish the show itself a little more than I do right now.
I think that's a very good sum up on that, to be honest, yes. There's more work to be done for all of us. Maybe not Neil Simon, as he's no longer available. I'd like now to move on to a totally different musical, a musical we saw yesterday, which at first glance could not be more different, and yet I think there are a number of parallels. The show's called Shreds, the Jack the Ripper musical, and I must say, before I went to this, it was on my list of shows that were intriguing me before I got to Edinburgh, and it eventually made the grade in the sense I bought a ticket and went to see it, as did you. But there is always a question of taste when it comes to Jack the Ripper issues, because obviously 5 people were murdered, possibly more. And the problem with Jack the Ripper is that it's become an industry. There's also a certain danger of falling into titillation. And ultimately, that's how I came to my conclusion that I would come and see this, because certainly from the blurb, if you like, online, it didn't suggest anything was going to be, it wasn't going to be a slash horror kind of send them up musical. It appeared to be sincere. What we got was indeed a sincere piece. The parallels, just so I am making myself plain, with Sweet Charity, or at least to me, was that it put the victims, in this case prostitutes, one step down from dance hall hostesses, certainly in the pecking order of society, at the forefront. They were the centre of the piece, particularly Mary Ann Kelly, the last victim. Sorry, spoilers, but there we are. There was very unlikely to be that ending was not ever not going to happen, if it makes any sense. But you've got working class women at the bottom of the social ladder questioning their position, in Mary Ann Kelly's case particularly, and she's the central character in this. She calls herself Rhea for a bit, but it's Mary Ann Kelly, the last victim. She has had better times, and she's still hoping for better times and to escape her circumstances. So you've got that Charity-esque thing. She's sort of got a heart of gold, actually. You know, she seems to be less cynical, at least in some ways, than her colleagues. And she's got 2 or 3 friends who are very, very cynical prostitutes. So you've got that. It also had, and this is a parallel with Sweet Charity again, in my view, a tremendous score and a slightly weaker narrative. So that's my sort of hot take on Shreds, the Jack the Ripper musical. I'd be very interested to hear your views on it.
I'll point out two details at the get-go. I believe the subtitle is A Jack the Ripper musical. And I think this is significant, not in just that it's acknowledging that, as you say, it's an industry and there are many Jack the Ripper musicals. There's probably several going on at Fringe at the same time.
Yes.
But it also suggests that this is going to be a different interpretation of the mythology surrounding Jack the Ripper. And with that implication, I agree. This is a show that, to draw a somewhat strained analogy, there is some
We're good at those on musical talk.
Yes.
You so go right ahead.
That's our specialty. You could almost compare it to a film like Titanic, where there is a known disaster with a known ending, and there's no way to get around that. And the focus then becomes on a pair of a couple, a romantic couple, in the context of this disaster. And the question is, can they get by during this disaster? Can they thrive? Are they part of it? What is their role, etc.? So rather than seeing this fatalistic, we know where this is going to end kind of story, where we know there's going to be a bunch of bodies, there's a real sense of stakes. We do not actually know this is Mary Ann Kelly at the start of the show.
No, not until right towards the end.
She steps out and says, "My name is," and then she doesn't finish the sentence, which is very clever because it doesn't reveal her fate. Likewise, I believe when she's mentioned, she does have a pseudonym, her whore name. Her Horan name,
which is pretty much the term they use in the piece. So we're not being disrespectful.
Exactly.
Yes, quite.
We're lifting terminology from the story, and I think at the end they say her name is Mary, but they don't elaborate the full name until the end. Is that right?
Yeah, we get the Kelly at the very end.
Exactly. So,
and there's a couple of hints as well, further hints, because another prostitute turns up about 2/3 of the way through the plot, also from Ireland, who calls herself Maria. And the character we ultimately realise is Mary Ann Kelly says, we're all called Mary here.
So we don't exactly. So we don't know that this. We don't know the fate of our main character. So the idea of the show, which I will separate from how well it executed that idea, is that we've got a couple swept up by these disastrous events, and we want to know how do they emerge and how involved are they in the events. There's a gentleman she meets who is a kind of romantic idealist. He's searching for his someone. He's taken his search to the bordellos of London. He is betrothed, as we learn, to a society girl, a girl of the aristocracy in some way.
Seems to be suggested. Her father is a knight anyway. He's Sir Thomas somebody. Or
That's
other.
right.
Yeah, it's quite
Clearly, it's
well-to-do.
It's a prospective union that is not bringing him joy. He's very hesitant, and he's casting out on this search. And we, the audience, knowing what kind of musical this is, immediately start wondering, is this Jack the Ripper? And I won't spoil the answer to that question, but it is on our mind for a lot of the show.
Which brings us, I think, to one or two of the slight weaknesses of the story. And I'm sorry to say this because I enjoyed it a great deal. So let me put that card on my table. I enjoyed it as a musical. I thought it was intriguing and interesting, tastefully done, sensitively done, and the score was magnificent, and we'll certainly talk about that. But the plot, I think my problem is, the way it felt to me was that it seemed to me to have been pieced together, or at least someone in the storytelling team must be quite an expert on Jack the Ripper, because there were little throwaway lines for the aficionados, if that can be possibly the right term. There's a reference to Martha Tabram, who is such an obscure character in the Jack the Ripper story. It's an immediate clue. She was a victim before the famous Five, who is sometimes attributed as a kind of sort of warm-up murder by Jack the Ripper. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but... and then our lawyer fellow, the one who's on his search for real love, is called John Druitt. And Druitt is a famous name connected, one of the suspects. And then more strangely, particularly if you don't know the ins and outs of the Jack the Ripper story, at the time there were 3 or 4 main suspects, one of whom was a member of the royal family, in this case the Duke of Clarence, and another was a doctor. And both these characters turn up. There's a doctor who appears to be assisting the police, but also sort of when he finishes his daytime shift assisting the police, goes off to sort of society balls by the sound of it. And we have the Duke of Clarence, who I think is the royal prince. I think he's Prince Albert. I think he's the... I don't actually know my Victorian royal family well enough to be able to tell you what he ultimately became. But there was at the time a rumour that a member of the royal family was Jack the Ripper somehow. And in this, the Duke of Clarence turns up with his male concubine. with whom he has sex a couple of times, and then he disappears from the story. So he has no bearing on the story whatsoever, unless you're looking for suspects. But he's not given any motivation, and nor is the Doctor. So whilst you're offered a series of possible suspects, there's only really one on the table.
I think we are both discerning that the intention here was to give us a series of male characters who could have been Jack the Ripper, so that we are not immediately pegging the co-protagonist as Saucy Jack himself. The problem was that all these secondary characters didn't have any obvious bearing on the through line of the story, which is this tense romantic love triangle. So we're trying to track all these characters who are introduced to us, and we're not quite sure where they're going or what their connection is. There's a moment where we digress to, I guess, Parliament.
Yes.
Which is very entertaining from the standpoint of staging, because every cast member, male and female, takes a fake beard and they talk in a stuffy fashion. Yeah, exactly. And I think there was some song there, right?
Yes, I think so, but it was hard to remember, actually.
Because it didn't feel like part and parcel of the story.
It had no function.
Exactly. There's a lot of...
It was almost an unnecessarily satirical sideswipe.
Exactly. It seemed like they were, given what we saw, it seemed like they were just using the occasion to make fun of government or high society. And when you have an hour-long show, if you introduce a character, there had better be some purpose to that character. When the policeman first came on the scene, I figured that was just an expositional device, because he was interviewing people and trying to find out what's going on with Jack the Ripper. It's like a CSI moment. I accepted that. But as this story went on and we learned more about the private life of the Duke, and I'm trying to figure out whose story is this? What's going on? And are we going to find out who Jack the Ripper is? So there was a lot of pieces on the board, but they weren't placed in a way that made logical sense.
It wasn't very coherent in that sense, I thought. And yet there were some choices in the writing and the direction which I thought were very sensitive and very sensible. So, for example, we don't linger on all 5 deaths, in the sense of one is mentioned in passing, which worries everyone. We see that in a news sheet, which is slowly ripped up by every member of the cast who create the shreds. And the word shred is plopped into the dialogue here and there. Whether that was a heavy-handed device or not is yet to be determined, but it was there and someone had thought about it and it was placed, so it's a perfectly reasonable title for the show. We see one of the cohort of prostitutes does get murdered, but it's done with lights. So, fortunately there's no man in a cape and a top hat turning up and, a flash of a glint of a blade and screaming. She's at the end of the stage and suddenly, actually I thought it was very cleverly done, glaring bright lights are fired into the audience. And so the stage is essentially dark and we can't see. We hear her scream and off she goes. And it's actually quite tastefully done for what the circumstances are. Same again for Mary Ann Kelly, sorry, spoilers, but except she gets the red light. But it's the same effect. There are bright red lights go on, you're sort of semi-blinded. There's also other stuff going on the stage at her point. They weren't gory and they weren't played upon. So the deaths were done very sensitively. And of course, the other prostitutes, Elizabeth Stride and people like that, I think, aren't really mentioned, or they might be dropped into the conversation, but not necessarily as victims. So we know they're around, but what we don't get is 5 set-piece deaths, and I've been worrying that we were going to dwell far too much on the murders and not on the story. And they chose the right decision. What we got was the story.
What I really like about this show is the premise of focusing on a compromised love relationship in the midst of the Jack the Ripper killings, rather than focusing on the killings themselves. They're the backdrop and part of the mystery. I was really engaged by Mary's struggle to get away from her abusive husband and her possible connection with John, I think, is the confused gentleman.
John Druitt, yeah, that's right.
And his struggle to disengage from his engagement. Those were real struggles that I connected to and that I was interested in seeing resolve. And for me, this was the through line of the story. And what we're describing, listeners, is all this stuff that was also happening that was distracting us from the love story at the center, and that did not really feel like it contributed to that story.
Because it didn't really help the mystery either.
No, it didn't. Yeah. In fact, it was there was a lot of music, a tremendous amount of music, in addition to the high quality of it. Now, I'm going to bring some breaking news to the table. This is a Musical Talk Bulletin, because this morning I picked up the program for the show and read through it. And I learned that this show is meant to be over 2 hours long.
Is it?
It is. And what we are seeing is the 1 hour Fringe version.
Oh.
So I saved this dramatic twist after we discussed our dissatisfactions with the story.
You are Jack the Ripper!
So I think that what we're seeing, this confusion and not quite understanding decisions and not understanding why these characters are here, were at least part due to this editorial process. Going from 2 hours plus to 1 hour is huge. And it's also difficult because you as the author don't know you may not know what the audience needs to know and what is superfluous.
Editing is a very difficult job, and if it works, it's invisible. When it doesn't work, it is all too visible.
And I think there may have been cases where the writers didn't want to completely part with some characters, so kept them in despite them having perhaps more meaningful roles and arcs in the full version. But I think this may be a cautionary tale about trying to edit too much.
Yes.
It might have been the case that this show would be better served as a concert presentation of the music, perhaps with a narrator filling in some of the details, because it did not feel like they successfully condensed a larger story into this space.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated to know that, because I didn't know it, and it would explain a lot. And bearing in mind the sensitivity that we have detected, it will be very interesting to see the full 2-hour show, because it may yet be that actually the story coheres considerably better, and therefore what we've seen is a bad representation of a very good piece. I'd love to know more about that. Now I'm intrigued, because now I want to see the 2-hour version. I agree with you that yes, perhaps a narrator to a bridge would have been a better choice. I suppose sometimes there is that question, isn't there? That actually if you cannot make your material fit the format that you've booked, you either need to change your format or you need to think again. Oh, well, that does put it in a very, very different light. And as you say, it sounds like, or it seems very likely, therefore, that it is just an unfortunate editing selection.
I wish we could pull the show authors out of a closet, like in Annie Hall, and then ask them what the full version of the show is like, and maybe a little bit of journalism on our part is called for here.
What did you make of the score, then? Let's talk about this, because the score is the glory.
I thought the score is fantastic. It could be described as neoclassical with a little bit of chromaticism to represent the dark and creepy elements of Jack the Ripper mythology.
It evoked Gothic backgrounds, didn't it, in that sense?
That's a good description. Perhaps a distant cousin to the score of House of Edgar. With the score here was just piano, so it was a little monochromatic in its orchestration, but it was very rich. It was exceedingly melodic. There were melodies that I could remember an hour after having seen the show.
Which is a rare thing in reality.
Especially after having seen 4 shows in one day. To have a melody linger is high praise. I thought the vocal writing was spectacular. The melodies had that combination of dramatic leaps and motion and poignancy that really made them stand out. The spotting wasn't always perfect in that there were some moments where emotionally the music wasn't quite on axis for the moment, but emotionally, the connotations of the music may have been too positive for what were going on, but these are minor quibbles amidst a lot of admiration for this score. And that's why before I knew that this was a condensed version, I was a little frustrated because I felt like the score deserved richer story environments than it had.
And it turns out it may well actually have had that originally. And again in future, hopefully.
I really hope that this Fringe version is just a passing phase or an interim version, because I would love to see the show continue with a more logical and perhaps elaborated story.
What I liked about the score was its variety, actually, in the sense of it was clearly united in the sense of, from the one... Well, I don't know if it was from one person, but it spoke with one voice. It was an integrated score in that sense. But you had vibrant ensemble numbers, sensitively placed individual numbers. I got Sondheim flavours myself. There was quite a lot of sort of chord striking, but sensitively done once again. I don't have your terminology, I'm afraid, but it was possibly one of the strongest new scores I've seen this year, I think, or heard this year.
I agree, and I think, obviously I agree, I just said the same thing. I also think it might be considered a relative of Sweeney Todd, and obviously the subject matter is similar in terms of setting and the macabre nature of all the murders, but it is entirely melodically distinct. You would never think that one song was similar to another, but the stylistic flavor perhaps is cut from the same cloth, and that's a terrible mixture of metaphors.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because you do see the gory deaths in Sweeney Todd. It sort of has its cake and eat it, but then again Sweeney Todd is a fictional story, whereas Jack the Ripper is a real story. I would feel much more uncomfortable if if there was proper slashing going on. I would consider it to be in really tremendously poor taste and would be most uncomfortable with the piece. And I wasn't uncomfortable. I've never been particularly uncomfortable with Sweeney Todd, but that's because I know it's sensitive and clever and intelligent, but ultimately hokum.
And Sweeney Todd, of course, the murders are integral to the progress of the main character. Whereas here, as far as we know, they are environmental. They are exterior to the main characters.
Yes, absolutely. They are contextual in that sense, aren't they? Well, so on the whole then, Shred's a Jack the Ripper musical, very, very promising, we think, for them.
I agree, and I would really be interested in seeing this again in a more expanded form. And I also feel motivated to see if there's a cast album recording online, because I just enjoy the music that much.
And the third show we're going to be talking about today, very different in style, very different in tone, completely contemporary. How to use a washing machine. A sort of oddly pathetic title for ultimately an investigation into the relationship of two siblings going back to their family house for what they expect to be the last time to pack up their childhood belongings, because their parents are getting a divorce and the implication is that they're moving out of the house, and so it's the last time. The parents are never seen. They're heard occasionally in the background. I thought that was a very nice way of letting you know that the house environment was a lived-in one, so it made it less sterile. And then we have a brother and sister who have their own personalities and their own problems, both contemporary problems in their own lives and with each other's relationship now, and their historic relationship, all of which gets churned up in a big melee of emotion as part of a string quartet musical, which I thought was astounding. I was very impressed by it. I liked it a great deal. I found the musical soundscape fabulous, actually. I thought the use of four string instruments to give it a tone and a feel and a flavour which I wasn't expecting, making it a sort of little chamber musical, really, I think, and suitably intimate in feel to match the emotional introversion that we were being offered up, because the characters displayed their emotion both in their interactions with each other but also then in sizable monologues towards the end where they were on their own, obviously, musing on their circumstances. I hope that's a fairish description of the piece as I see it, but I may have missed subtleties, which you've seen, Mike. So,
I agree. I think the string quartet was a fresh and novel choice for the instrumentation. I think a contemporary show with a lot of psychological action and introspection and personal relationships and angst would more commonly be served by a band, a pop band of some kind, or a solo piano, and the quartet was just such an interesting choice. The composer knew how to write for strings. The writing was very idiomatic. There were a lot of great uses of string techniques. There was even a really funny moment where I think there was a joke about abusing a cat or putting a cat in a microwave, not in a mean-spirited way, just in the spirit of, I think I accidentally microwaved the cat or something like that.
It wasn't quite as horrific, but a cat was teased as a child. Yes.
Right, and the details don't matter in this case. And then there was a little bit of a high gliss, I think, on the cello that was mimetic of a cat meowing. Yeah. So there was, and that was just a string effect. So
also, when the washing machine goes wrong.
Was there something there?
Yes, there was a little bit of work on the, I don't know what you would call it, the fretboard, but it made it sound, there was something that made it sound a little bit like mechanical failure, at least to my ear.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't notice that. But generally, I really liked that color choice, and it gave the show a kind of musical signature and a distinct identity. It wasn't a gimmick. It really felt like it was part of the texture of the story.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because my prejudice, or at least my shorthand, would be, it's interesting you spoke about how a band might often be used in that circumstance, but that's, I think, if you're trying to go for what might be called the soul or the emotional, the unsubtle emotion of a character, I think can be portrayed better that way. I think naturally, I assume when I hear a string quartet, I sort of think of sort of pizzicato moments. For some reason or other, it seems to me a much more inward-looking sound, a much more inward-looking representation that you get from it. And so actually it seems to be very good for introspection. It seems to have that odd mixture of the small emotion, and it's the small emotions we're talking about here. They make big emotions when cumulatively put together. But there's a little bit of pain here, and a little cut there, and a snub here, and an upset there, and you put them together and you get the tumult of an emotional breakdown or whatever. But actually, it seems to me that strings help you put those things together. It's just more intricate, I think, is the word I'm looking for. And it was an intricate piece with an intricate quartet. And I think that's, for me, how those two things merge so successfully.
It's worth mentioning that the music is often very rhythmic and very agitated in a way that I think reflects the emotions of the characters. This isn't a lot of sob story, long legato lines.
Yeah.
It really was a lot of jagged rhythms and motoric sounds. I would almost say it's derived from minimalism, not in the sense of a lot of repetition, though there was some of that, but just in the sense of this motoric drive, like a John Adams or Philip Glass kind of approach to the music, on top of which the vocal melodies were a little more fluid and legato. It was and they gave the story a kind of impulse, because as the story begins, the two siblings are struggling with public transportation and trying to get home for the holidays, and I think it's snowing and there's delays, and as I understand in the UK it is not unheard of for a train to be late. And
it's not unheard of. I believe it's compulsory.
So there's this sense of, oh gosh, I got to get home, I'm stressed out, and the music reflects that very well. There's a kind of fragmentation of a phrase. I think it's "Why Today" lyrically.
Yes.
And it does convey the sense of anxiety in a way that's both musically pleasing, but that kind of clicks rhythmically.
Narratively, it also works because that "Why Today" song, as you say, is their opening number, and they're both being wrenched from their speech marks' real lives, and their real lives are very clearly isolated, and so they are not just unhappy about the fact that they're being dragged back to their family home for one last time. There's also a sense that the barriers that have been erected between them as a family, not just the brother and sister, but with the parents, one imagines, are having to be breached because of something. To me, I got a very strong sense of reluctance because of the event, but also because of the emotions that were almost expected to happen. The thing I found most fascinating for me in the book, however, was the use of infantilization. The sister is more damaged than the brother. The brother had unusual interests. When he was a boy, he wanted to become a ballerina. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a little unusual. His sister saw herself as artistic and has not been successful. She's also much more emotionally volatile. I think that would be fair to say. The brother has thrown away his ambitions and has become something very stolid, solid, dependable, but possibly dull. And when they meet, she chastises him for having changed. And then, she wants, in a way, she seems to be arguing that he should be the person that he was when he was younger. It turns out she's very conservative for an artistic person. She doesn't actually like any change. She doesn't seem to be able to cope with it.
Interesting point.
But she then infantilizes him. So they revert back to their childhood relationship because she acts like a child and brings on his childish responses. And then when he treats her as the older brother, which is the infantilized response to how they used to be, she then criticizes him for treating her like an infant. As far as I was concerned, I found her harder to like or respond to because she was, it's a terrible thing to say, because she was more damaged. But that damage came out in more spiteful behaviour, more volatile behaviour. It didn't seem to me that he had done anything particularly wrong with his life, or indeed particularly wrong with her. She would poke him with a stick, essentially, and then when he reacted, she would criticise him. And I found, having been a sibling as a child, I'm still one now, incidentally, but obviously the circumstances are different, there was enough in that, particularly as I was the older brother, to remind me of my own childhood in some senses, perhaps not as acutely, but I was interested in the circularity of infantilism.
I see more parallelism between the two than perhaps you do. In that Cass, the artistic free spirit who's living the bohemian life of lots of roommates and not
actually enjoying it.
Exactly. She is she's kind of coming from a childish perspective. She's early 20s, and as you say, she's more damaged and on a very unpredictable life trajectory at the moment. Her brother, on the other hand, is also, as you said, more in a solid, predictable, entrenched field with a clear future ahead of him. I think he's a banker or something like that.
Something financial, wasn't it?
She is struggling with the realities of the world and the need to get by in the world. He, I think, has found a way to get by in the world, but he's struggling with his own discontent because he's really left behind his artistic his creative life is left behind.
His work-life balance is very bad. We get the impression he works very, very hard, almost to the exclusion of other things. There's some sense that he hasn't actually got a wide circle of friends anymore, and when he does, they're the boys. he got criticised for calling his sort of gang of mates the boys, and he meets them down the pub, which he hasn't done for a long time. And there's also a sense that he hasn't got any close, intimate friends, certainly no girlfriend. So yes, I agree with that he has a more overtly successful life.
So I think we have
with problems.
Two people trying to find their way in life. One is focusing way too much, almost exclusively on his career and in a very dependable world. The other of whom is neglecting the element of cultivating stability in your life, and she's all ego and no id, and she's trying to be a painter and doesn't seem to have a coherent plan. So they've both drifted in opposite directions, and each prompts the other to reevaluate the course of their life and to really consider a course change. And this manifests first in what seems like the kind of teasing, poking fun at and needling that you'd expect from siblings, and evolves into much more serious mutual critique, which in turn prompts a lot of reflection, and the implication being perhaps some change of life direction. And that is the real arc of the story. It's the two siblings helping one another, seemingly through an adversarial confrontation.
Yes, it's the positive outcome of an antagonistic relationship, isn't it? It is exactly that, but I would describe it slightly more as a nudge in the right direction. I don't think it wasn't a simplistic, I thought about what my sibling has said and they are right, and therefore I'm now going to change my life. It was, there may be something in what they said. I'm reluctantly going to have to take on board some of their comments. They are fair.
The beginning of progress.
Yes, exactly. Yes, exactly. There's a kind of rapprochement towards the end, which ultimately always happens with siblings, certainly in a childhood environment, because you live with them. You have to sort of come to some conclusion. You can't walk out forever. But it wasn't, my life is going to be completely changed. I think it was actually the balance has shifted in both their own lives and in their relationship. But they're a very odd, well, no, not very odd. I think in the sense, actually, they may be surprisingly common. One gets the impression that there's love between them, but they don't much like each other as siblings.
I disagree.
Oh, right, go on.
Yeah, no, I think that they are immensely fond of each other. No, I think there's true fondness crystallized from childhood, and there's some frustration because each sees the other going in the wrong way. And perhaps they don't have the skill set to present that concern in a mature fashion, so it manifests in squabbling and disappointment, and you're not who I remembered, et cetera, et cetera. But, and I also think it's fueled by a lot of self-criticism. As each is lashing out at the other, I think they're also feeling the weight of their own disappointment and perhaps the mounting sense of, I really need to rethink of my own life. But I think there's real love between the two characters that's just been clouded by conflict and fear about their own worlds.
But you can love someone or not like them.
But there's so much fondness. But you
think so?
In describing this musical, we've made it sound a lot more grim than it actually is.
Yes, and it's not at all, no.
It is joyous, it is fun, it is witty, it is full of particulars that are very vivid and true to life. There's, particularly in the opening, there's just a lot of fun. There's a lot of wit and banter. So you couldn't have had that atmosphere in the show if the two characters didn't like each other.
You see, because the reason I still hold to my particular view is that I got the impression that, I certainly didn't get the impression that once the family house had broken up, the brother and sister would see very much more of each other. And we'd already had a sense of drifting apart quite considerably when it was a little throwaway, wasn't it? But the brother didn't go to their last Christmas, ostensibly because he was too busy. But, that's a big statement, not going to your family Christmas. But maybe we're seeing this through the prism of our own family relationships. I don't know.
Could well be. I saw this as the instigation of healing that will continue in their future. Perhaps not in the case of the parents, but in the case of the siblings.
But healing in the sense of their relationship with each other or their own individual way of living.
I would say both.
Oh, you see, that's interesting.
I don't see them as drifting apart forever from this moment.
I saw much more change in themselves and much less change in their relationship with each other. But because I found it, I didn't see them escaping that. I thought that the changes which they had been generated in each other were the things they were doing in their separate lives, not in their shared lives, and therefore that's where I saw the greater effect. But then again, I suspect that this is the nature of a good piece, that actually we're able to have this slightly different interpretation. And it is only a slight difference, because we both thought it was good, we both thought it was interesting, and we both think that the central thrust is there. It's always an interesting game, I think, to wonder what the sequel to any given piece of drama might be. And I think rarely would people have the same view.
Now, have you already interviewed the creators of this show?
Yes, I've had the great pleasure of meeting them both, the writer and the composer.
Did they weigh in on this subject of debate that we are now having?
No, I didn't touch on this, actually, funny enough, so I have no way of giving you an authoritative answer on as to which of us might be correct or whether we're both wrong.
Right. There might be a boiler explosion in the next scene after the show is over, and perhaps they're all dead.
Well, I don't like your sequel at all. Well, bringing today's conversation towards a close, there's just one more little musical, and it is a little musical, I think, which we both enjoyed, and was a great deal of fun. And, well, would you care to describe it?
Sure. The piece was called Space Junk, a Soviet musical, and it was a bio-jukebox musical.
That rare breed.
That rare breed, focusing on the life, and you can hopefully fill in the blanks, because I don't remember the gentleman's name, but it was the first Russian cosmonaut.
Yuri Gagarin.
And it focused specifically on his life after his first career-defining mission. It begins with him emerging from having just landed very poorly in a field after having, as we learned, bailed out from his capsule. And it talks about his desire to return to space and his conflict with the Soviet government that is frankly afraid to send him up again out of fear that their national hero might die.
Yes.
And how does he deal with being grounded and the psychological ramifications and how it impacts his family life, et cetera, et cetera. This description that I'm giving you does nothing to capture the spirit of this thing, which is amazingly eccentric and goofy and silly and riddled with Elton John and David Bowie songs, I think predominantly, if not exclusively.
With, let us not ever be subtle, Rocket Man, Starman, Major Tom, you know,
Right.
it's quite spacey stuff.
Very astronomically themed pop tunes from the 60s and 70s.
As I say, spacey stuff.
Spacey stuff. So it's silly. It's a silly, eccentric, and whimsical presentation of an actual dramatic story, which is a combination I don't think I've seen before, either as a jukebox musical or as a straight musical. So it was.
They can be po-faced sometimes, can't they?
Yeah, exactly. It was one of these oddities that Fringe is great for bringing out of the woodworks. Fringe gives you an opportunity to stage things like this that are crazy but satisfying at the same time.
I agree with you absolutely. It's all about the tone, because if it had been po-faced, it would have been terrible. But then again, you couldn't have used those particular songs, I think. I think they would have jarred. So, although those songs are ostensibly serious, they're also a little camp. I think the piece is not camp, but it's certainly enhanced. It's periodically absurd as well. It's and the chap playing Yuri Gagarin, I think, actually gets across his own vulnerabilities very well and his weaknesses, whilst being quite a likeable chap. This was Gagarin's actual characteristic was quite unlike Neil Armstrong, that he was quite charming. That he was. I think they reference this in the piece. That actually, he's the first sort of Soviet Russian that the world takes to, because he's quite charming and nice and has done something, humane for everyone, as it were. Something towards humanity, and not. Obviously, it is a great flag-waving moment for the communist regime, but it feels bigger than that, and he's a great representation of that. Which is not to say he's not a massively, massively flawed character. I mean, it is the rise and fall of Yuri Gagarin in many ways.
Indeed, most bio-musicals or biofilms follow a trajectory of initial success, followed by frustration, inevitable substance abuse, some kind of destructive moment, and then possible reconciliation. And that's just because the stories that these shows tend to be based on follow that trajectory to begin with. So real life does not neatly follow a narrative that feels like classical storytelling. So we often see this pattern where ups and downs that we'd expect in a celebrity life are turned into story points. And that was the case here.
You mean the 7 classical plots, of which there are supposed to be only 7, reflect unreal life but do not reflect real life?
Exactly. And I think they did... In addition to the framing in this silly, zany storytelling style, I think they did a decent job of trying to carve out a story-like trajectory of a human biography.
Very much so, whilst keeping the joy levels up.
We should point out that, for example, when he's doing battle with alcoholism, he's literally struggling with an actor wearing a giant vodka bottle costume.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the level of silly we're talking about here.
Yes,
in another moment, Yuri is consulting with a colleague who wants to show off a new fancy plane, And the actor playing the colleague turns to the drummer
Yes.
and recruits him quite against his will to come on stage and raise his arms side to side and run around like a plane. So the fourth wall is in shambles at this point, and members of the band are being brought into the show in a very entertaining way.
And some of the smaller characters, so for example, we briefly see a Russian admiral, a naval admiral, who's dressed in Russian Admiralty costume and yet speaks with what I think of as a West Country pirate's accent. It's all "arr," I'm gonna "arr," which got a great laugh. And yet the flip side to that is the moments of sensitivity when they're required as well, because we then see the cosmonauts who are trained by Yuri Gagarin and the first woman in space, one of whom is selected to go into space, and unfortunately there's a terrible disaster and dies. And that's done very sensitively. So it's not one note. There's more cleverness in it than perhaps at first meets the eye.
Yeah, it's not just a romp. It's not just a farce. It's a real story with dramatic junctures and deep human emotions being told in a very whimsical style. And
yes.
It strangely works.
It is indeed a space oddity.
It is not a musical per se, not just because the tunes are being borrowed from the pop vocabulary, but the songs tend to be embellishments to the story rather than story moments themselves. So in that sense, it's more akin to a play with music, but that's fine. It really just seems to fit naturally into this crazy world that the show authors have carved out.
And we both enjoyed it.
We did indeed. This is one of the things that Fringe has to offer, this kind of zany project that could probably not survive commercially, but can find a home here at this festival.
Yes, I don't see this at the Palladium, I must say.
The licensing fees for the songs would probably be prohibitive.
Well, that as well. Yeah. Well, they made up for that by having papier-mâché cosmonauts helmets.
Right, that's true. Forgotten.
Which I wouldn't use in space, I must say, if I was going.
Depends on the space.
Well, talking of which, we're about to go from this space to another, because we've actually got a show we're going to see now. So, Mike, it's always great to catch up with you here on The Fringe, and your insights are always thoughtful for me. So like the brother and sister pair in How to Use a Washing Machine, I'm now going to go off and see if you've changed my life.
And likewise, and we will have another show discussing what we've seen at Fringe when we both return to London in a week or so.
Another wrap-up, absolutely.
So I will see you then.
Looking forward to it. Thank you, Mike.
Likewise.
Musical talk. There we are, the ever-talented, the ever-wonderful, the ever-lovely Michael Gordon Shapiro. Talking about Sweet Charity, Shreds, a Jack the Ripper musical, How to Use a Washing Machine, and Space Junk, a Soviet musical. All very different shows, and yet all well worth seeing. And of course, a tiny drop in the ocean of all the shows that you could have seen at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe this year. And to prove it, in my next episode we'll be talking about many more. In fact, you might call it a further list. In fact, listing is one of the things I like to do very much, but that's probably because the sole on one of my shoes is taller than on the other. I'll give you a second to work that one through, and while you're thinking about it, I shall make my daring escape by saying goodbye for this episode. I won't use all those words, probably just the first one. Like this. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos Ribbits and Michael Gordon Shapiro and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2019. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.
Apologize in advance for squinting. My eyes are very light sensitive, so if I do this, it's not because I'm suspicious. I'm fine. Just the side effect is to be a little bit squinty, so I just wanted to forewarn you that has no emotional significance, just physical.
I'm used to repulsion. I have it in spades.
Yeah.
I'm going to put that there then. Just, do you want to give me a level, old fellow?
I am speaking at a reasonable conversational level. This is probably, you're not going to make me louder than you, which is what you tend to do. Please, I suggest you balance this equally.
But I'm going to lean in, so do you feel that's about right?
As long as you do lean in, because in the past there have been occasions where I've been louder than you, and that makes me a little self-conscious and also isn't entirely fair to the listener, given that your voice is so much nicer.
Oh, pish. And tush, as they say. And I think the odd couple is, I'll say that again,